Well, hello and good morning to Sunday Coffee with Dr. Childress. Today I'm going to be talking about my encounter with various systems and the forensic psychologists and the family courts, and describing sort of where I stand on the current situation, which is like where you stand as well. So I'll be talking about what's currently going on in the encounter phase. The first thing I want to note is my background. That my education includes a master's degree in clinical community psychology. And I want to talk for a second about the community psychology component. And what that is, it's organizational development, but more so focused on community psychology, which is treating pathology by changing the systems that surround the pathology and that interact with it. And so it's intervening on a community level for a pathology, such as changing the mental health system in the family courts and the family court response to the pathology, the attachment pathology, as a way of resolving the pathology rather than going in case by case trying to solve things. So it's a community based intervention. So I'm actually trained in exactly what I'm doing here, which is changing systems to treat the pathology. And to orient to my role, I have obligations. And so that's been governing my actions this entire time, continues to govern my actions until my obligations are discharged. First, I have two ethical obligations to standards 1.04 and 1.05. When I believe there may have been an ethical violation by another psychologist, I do, by a group of psychologists. Um, and then I also have duty to protect obligations relative to two dangerous pathologies in the family courts, possible child or actual real child abuse by one parent to the other, but possible psychological abuse of the child by the allied parent who's creating a delusional thought disorder, factitious attachment pathology in the child, and possible spousal abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child as a weapon. So I've got two dangerous pathologies potentially involved. And they're both active. Neither one is being treated or responded to by the mental health system in the family courts. So I have two active abuse pathologies. So my duty to protect is active, and that's what's governing what I do. The violations to ethical standards, I believe they are rampant and widespread, pretty much universal. Violations to standard 2.01, boundaries of competence 2.04, bases for scientific and professional judgments, and 9.01, bases for assessment, because their opinions, as expressed in their reports and recommendations, including the forensic testimony, are not based on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings. I also believe, fairly confidently, that the forensic custody evaluators and the mental health professionals in the family courts are in violation of their duty to protect obligations. Let me talk about that for a second. There's three types of dangerous pathology: suicide, homicide, and abuse. That's a category of pathology called dangerousness: suicide, homicide, and abuse. Whenever a mental health professional encounters any of those three dangerous pathologies — suicide, homicide, abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, or elder abuse — duty to protect obligations are active, and they must do three things. First, they must conduct a proper risk assessment or ensure that a proper risk assessment is conducted. Second, they need to take an affirmative protective action, such as um, increasing the frequency of sessions or maybe contacting support people with proper permissions or something like that. They need to make sure everybody's safe. And third, they need to document the results of the risk assessment, such as a suicide risk assessment, if they conducted one, and they must document in the patient's medical record what affirmative protective action they took. That's for all dangerous pathologies: suicide, homicide, abuse. In the family courts, we got two that are a concern: child psychological abuse by the allied parent, creating a delusional thought disorder, factitious attachment pathology for secondary gain, and possible spousal abuse of the targeted parent, using the child as a spousal abuse weapon. So, uh, yeah, there's my duty to protect are active because the mental health system is responding to neither of those potential abuse pathologies. And every mental health professional in the court would have similar active duty to protect obligations. So, in terms of my ethical obligations under 1.04, and this will become relevant in a little bit, when psychologists believe that there may have been an ethical violation by another psychologist, they attempt to resolve the issue by bringing it to the attention of that individual, if an informal resolution appears appropriate and doesn't violate confidentiality. So if I believe there may have been an ethical violation to 2.01, 2.04, 9.01, then I am obligated, mandatory, this is required, to bring it to the attention of that person. Okay, ethical standards for the APA here are not optional for psychologists. They are mandatory. And so I have to make the person aware. And this is the self-corrective mechanism within the ethics code for ethical violations, because the licensing boards can't be everywhere. Now, it's their obligation to enforce ethical standards, but they can't be everywhere. And so, but psychologists, we interact with our own. And so if we're worried about something in other psychologists, it's our obligation to bring it up to them, make them aware of that. Well, I'm concerned about 2.01, 2.04, 9.01 throughout all of the forensic psychologists in the family courts. My second obligation is under 1.05, which is if an apparent ethical violation has substantially harmed or is likely to substantially harm a person or organization and is not appropriate for informal resolution under standard 1.04, or is not resolved properly in that fashion, psychologists take further action appropriate to the situation. Such action might include referral to state or national committees on professional ethics, to state licensing boards, or to the appropriate institutional authorities. So we're not allowed to simply walk away if it's not resolved, and it hasn't been resolved. The concerns for 2.01 and 2.04 and 9.01 remain, and they're not appropriate for informal resolution across the whole scope of psychologists who are disregarding their ethical obligations for competence. And it's causing substantial harm to the children and parents in the family courts. So now I am obligated to take further action appropriate to the situation. What is that? That becomes an interesting question when the systems, the mental health system around, and the APA, the oversight systems, and the licensing boards, and the professional organizations are broken. And so they are non-responsive to reporting into them. So then what becomes the further action when those systems are themselves broken? And that becomes the community psychology component that I set about analyzing and figuring out what to do to fix the systems so that they would be responsive to the ethical violations and then improve the competence level that's being received by children and parents and the courts, up to just baseline professional levels of competence. So in terms of what I've done so far in providing notice, in 2017, I provided a presentation to the National Convention of the AFCC. That's the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. That's the professional organization, the appropriate institutional authorities. I went to their national convention, and I have a set of 7 slides that I showed them about the competence issues. And it's a section. And I said competence and discussed the boundaries of competence concerns. Then in 2018, I wrote a petition to the APA describing the ethical violations in the family courts, and describing the pathology and then the ethical violations. And it was signed by 20,000 parents, and I hand delivered it to the APA with assurances it would go to the APA Ethics Committee. And it's been years, 2018, and there's been no response from the APA Ethics Committee to the ethical violations I noticed them about under my obligations under 1.05. Now, in the state licensing boards, that's been more challenging to notice them because they, again, are being disabled. And my hypothesis on that is that they're being disabled by the forensic psychologists who sit on the licensing boards, so that no reports of ethical violations by the forensic psychologists are being responded to appropriately from the licensing boards because they're being disabled by the forensic psychologists on the board. But I'll let the licensing boards answer why they are not enforcing standard 2.01, 2.04, and 9.01 with the forensic psychologists in the family courts. And then more recently, or as recently, and I responded to the licensing boards. I noticed them via a response I made to Dr. Burnett and Lorandos made a board complaint against me because of my harsh criticism of them. So I responded to the licensing board explaining the criticism was valid. And then standard 1.04, I've just recently provided notice under that standard, made the people aware to several prominent forensic psychologists. So I've done my obligations up to this point. I've given notice to all the organizations, and they are non-responsive. I know they are non-responsive because I did my community psychology analysis back in 2008 to 2010, and I know what's going on. I know why the systems are broken, what happened with them, and how to fix them. And so I did not anticipate that my initial notice to these various agencies would be resolved. For the licensing boards, I've been encouraging parents to file licensing board complaints relative to 2.01 and 2.04, and they have resulted in no effect from the licensing boards. So I'll let the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, the oversight for all 50 licensing boards, I'll let them figure out why they have been non-responsive to the tremendously low caliber of services in the family courts. So basically what happened, why the system became disabled, mental health system in the family courts, is because the forensic psychologists, a group of psychologists, were allowed to experiment on children and parents. Now, that's a really bad thing to do without oversight, but they were allowed to do it. They were allowed to conduct an experiment on human subjects without any oversight or review. They were allowed to self-review. And they experimented on children and parents with this experimental quasi-judicial role for doctors, where they're no longer part of the healthcare system. They're now part of the legal system. They have some sort of quasi-judicial role advising the court on custody rather than a clinical role of diagnosis and treatment. So that's an experimental quasi-judicial role. And then they developed an experimental assessment procedure called a forensic custody evaluation for their new experimental role. And both of those, their experiment on the children and parents in the family courts failed miserably. And as a result of their failed experiment on human subjects in the family courts without oversight or review, a vulnerable population because of their impaired autonomy and decision making and their high need for mental health services. Because of their failed experiment, the lives of thousands and thousands of children and their parents were irrevocably destroyed. From the New York Blue Ribbon Commission on Forensic Custody Evaluations, an outside independent review. When an outside independent review eventually was conducted on this experiment that was being conducted, has been conducted, is being conducted on parents and children in the family courts, this is what the findings were. In some custody cases, because of lack of evidence or the inability of parties to pay for expensive challenges of an evaluation, defective reports can thus escape meaningful scrutiny and are often accepted by the court with potentially disastrous consequences for parents and children. By an 11-9 margin, a majority of commission members favor elimination of forensic custody evaluations entirely, arguing that these reports are biased and harmful to children and lack scientific legal value. At worst, evaluations can be dangerous, particularly in situations of domestic violence or child abuse. So I would suggest that the licensing boards consider, how is it that you're allowing a practice that is harmful to children, dangerous, that lacks scientific and legal value, and generating these defective reports, and you allow that? That's okay with all your licensing boards, that these forensic psychologists can do this dangerous thing without any oversight or review. And you're not enforcing ethical standards, 2.01, 2.04, 9.01. How did you allow this to take place? Okay, this is what's going on. I know because I'm the meaningful scrutiny. I read their reports. I go through them line by line. I have a whole catalog of concerns that are just standard. And yet the licensing boards are nowhere to be seen. How did that happen? We have disabled mental health system. What's disabling the mental health system? The forensic psychologists in the mental health system. So the New York Blue Ribbon Commission found they were dangerous, harmful to children, lack scientific or legal value, potentially disastrous consequences for parents and children, and recommend that they be eliminated entirely from the family courts. But what happens? And I agree, they should be eliminated entirely. They are dangerous. They are harmful to children. Absolutely. They do lack scientific. Absolutely should be eliminated. What happens, though, in the family courts when that takes place? Well, first, there's no mental health services in the family courts because that's the only mental health services they have. The parents and children have been isolated away from the rest of clinical psychology. This pathology, the rippling of sex abuse, isolates its victim, and that's exactly what took place here. The parents and children, the victim of the narcissistic borderline dark parent, have been isolated away from healthcare and away from diagnosis and treatment, and given their own special psychologists who could conduct an experimental approach that doesn't diagnose and treat pathology. And it's been a really bad situation for these parents. It's been horrific emotionally and psychologically for all the parents who had to go through that abuse. It's spousal abuse. It's a savage and brutal form of spousal abuse. And the children's lives were destroyed by the child abuse of a narcissistic borderline dark personality parent because of the failed experiment by these forensic custody evaluators. So the first thing that's going to happen if we eliminate forensic custody evaluations is that there's no mental health services in the family courts. Zero, none. Because clinical psychologists don't work here, and the only ones that are forensic that's all they do is their forensic custody. The second implication of that is that all the current forensic custody evaluators, from top to bottom, need to leave because their role, what they're trained in, and loosely speaking, what they do, their forensic is no longer a role in the family courts. So they went all in on this judicial role, this quasi-judicial role. It was a failed experiment. It needs to leave, and they need to leave with it. Well, that creates a tremendous conflict of interest within the forensic psychologists in the family courts, because we need to get back to clinical diagnosis and treatment. That's not something they do. And the moment we do that, they are history. They're gone. Their careers in the family courts are gone. So they don't want that. So they will disable the mental health system response for their own financial and career status gain. Forensic custody evaluations need to be eliminated. And with that, their careers will also be eliminated. So that's a really concerning situation right now, as we have forensic custody evaluators in positions of authority and power within the systems who are intentionally disabling the mental health system for their own financial and career status gain. Just to point out, a forensic custody evaluation takes between 6 to 9 months to complete, which is an abomination to me. A clinical diagnostic assessment would take between 6 to 8 weeks. So, and return a diagnosis of child abuse, which is what we're worried about in the situation, is child abuse. So rather than do a forensic custody, even if we were to keep them, which we don't, but even if we were, then let's just do a clinical diagnostic assessment right away for the possible child abuse in 4 to 8 weeks. And then if we need a custody evaluation, we can get one. However, the forensic custody evaluators have withheld clinical treatment, withheld clinical diagnosis and clinical diagnostic assessments from the parents and children and the family courts. So right now, you don't have the option of getting a clinical diagnostic assessment. Forensic custody evaluators don't do them. They don't know how to do them. And the clinical psychologists don't work in the family courts. And if you get a personality disorder psychologist, like a dialectic behavior therapist over, they're not going to know about delusional thought disorders. They're not going to know about attachment. They're not going to know about the family court custody situation. You get an attachment clinical psychologist in, they're not going to know the personality disorders, complex trauma, and the family court situation, delusional thought disorders. So no matter who you bring in from the outside, they haven't been working in the family courts, so they're not competent. And the forensic custody, you don't have competent mental health services in the family courts. Zero, nothing, nada. And that's always been the case, but it's now becoming clearly evident. So clinical psychology, diagnosis and treatment needs to return to court-involved custody conflict. Diagnosis and treatment, standard health care, is not currently available in the family courts. Zero, nothing. But and it's not in the family courts for 2 reasons. One is because of the failed experiment in forensic custody evaluations, basically cleared the field of the family courts of all clinical psychologists. The second is that it's too professionally dangerous for clinical psychologists to work in the family courts because, one, the pathological parent is very retaliatory and very dangerous, plus persecutory delusions. So they make false allegations. So the pathology itself is very dangerous to clinical psychologists. And second, the forensic custody evaluators in positions of authority and power are dangerous to any clinical psychologists who work in the family courts because they don't do what the custody evaluators do, and they have the power to decide what everybody does. So, so those are the 2 reasons why there's no standard healthcare practice, no diagnosis and treatment in the family courts. So again, to be clear, there are no competent mental health services in the family courts. As proof of that, let me say, the patient should never need to educate the doctor about the pathology. The doctor should already know. If the patient needs to educate the doctor about the pathology and its diagnosis and treatment, that doctor is not competent in that pathology based on their demonstrated need to be educated by the patient. And patients in the family courts are educating their doctors about what the pathology is. I know this to be true. Okay, so the level of incompetence in the family courts is substantial when you have the patients educating the doctors about what the pathology is. And where are the licensing boards? Nowhere to be seen. Why is that? They're being disabled by the forensic psychologists for their own personal, financial, and career status need. So, what I've done, further action appropriate to the situation. I've started a diagnosis series up on my YouTube channel. And so the first one was on the DSM-5 diagnosis of the family court pathology. So what is the DSM-5 diagnosis? And it is either it's a differential because a child is seeking to flee the targeted parent, um, severe attachment pathology. So, is it that the targeted parent is abusing the child in some way? Is it physical abuse? Is it sexual abuse? Is it neglect? Or is it psychological abuse? That's the first rule out on the differential diagnosis. Child seeking to flee a parent. Is that parent abusing the child in some way? If not, then the other half of the differential becomes active, which is it a delusional disorder, shared persecutory type 297.1? I'm even giving you the DSM numbers. I'm spoon feeding you, mental health people, the diagnosis here. Is it 300 or, a factitious disorder imposed on another, 300.19? Which either one or both of those is a child psychological abuse diagnosis, and we'd want to rule out the spousal abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child as a weapon. So there's your DSM-5 diagnoses. Now, my second in the series, of the diagnosis series, was on the forensic psychology in the quasi-judicial role. So I address what's currently going on and our need to get back to diagnosis. The third in the series was on assessing parenting. And so I didn't start in immediately into the diagnosis. I laid back a little bit and did my third one on assessing parenting because that's what the courts or everybody is saying they're concerned about. We're assessing parenting, not diagnosing pathology. Well, if you want to assess parenting, that's how you do it right here. Okay, it's an applied behavioral analysis, behavior chain interviewing, and you structure up your results as to what type of strategies is a parent using and supported with examples. Assessing parenting is going to be highly vulnerable to cultural biases and cultural influences, assessing families, family conflict, as well as personal countertransference stuff. If you had a bad marriage or came from a bad family, that's going to influence the perceptions of the assessing psychologist. So when we're assessing parenting and families, we need to be very structured in how we do it so that we can avoid a lot of the cultural or personal biases that can creep into that assessment and our opinions. In the absence of child abuse, parents have the right to parent according to their cultural values, their personal values, and their religious values. And in the absence of child abuse, each parent should have as much time and involvement with the child as possible. To restrict either parent's time and involvement with the child for something other than child abuse would damage the child's attachment bond to that parent, thereby harming the child and harming the parent. The only relevant question for the doctors, for the healthcare field, is there child abuse? If there's no child abuse, parents have a right to parent. Then custody decisions can be made based on the court's evaluation of the situation and when the law is applied to the situation. What the court needs to understand, the information that is of value to it relative to a child who's seeking to flee a parent, is which parent is abusing the child. Because one or the other that's the only thing that creates a child wanting to flee a parent. Is child abuse either by the targeted parent or psychological abuse by the allied parent? So, in all of these custody evaluations, a diagnosis of child abuse should be returned because that's the only thing that causes the symptom is child abuse. And in how many cases is it being returned? 0. I can guarantee you then that the psychologists are failing to conduct a proper assessment and failing in their duty to protect. When the only possible cause is child abuse, and they're not returning a diagnosis of child abuse on one parent or the other, they're failing in their duty to protect. That's just a fact. So I explained how to assess for parenting. Okay, that's number 3. My next one that I'm currently working on is going to be how to assess for the delusional thought disorder. I want to take some time on that because that's going to be a central diagnosis. So the 4th in the series is going to be how to assess for a persecutory delusion, shared, and the diagnosis of that. And then the 5th one will be the assessment and diagnosis of a factitious disorder imposed on another. And so I'm going to get the 2 DSM diagnoses coming up in the next 2 chapters. So stay tuned. Those are on their way. In addition, though, since 2015, I've had symptom documentation checklists up on my website. And I recommend everybody collect this from your mental health people. Ask your mental health people to document the symptoms using the diagnostic checklist for pathogenic parenting, and to document the parenting practices, their clinical judgment of the parenting practices of the targeted parent using the parenting practices rating scale. Are they normal range parent or are they an abusive parent? Let's get that documented so we can stop fighting about it and get second opinions on it too if you want. Let's do a parenting assessment, but let's get documentation of what the targeted parent is doing. Is it normal range or is it abusive range? Then the other is the 3 symptoms of the child. Is there attachment suppression towards a normal range parent? Is the child rejecting a normal range parent? Are there 5 specific narcissistic symptoms in the child's symptom display, or a severe anxiety that would meet diagnostic criteria for a specific phobia, a mother phobia or father phobia? So those are the 2 variants of the symptoms. Is a child excessively angry or excessively anxious? And then the 3rd symptom is, does the child have a persecutory delusion? Does it towards a normal range targeted parent? Document that up. Now, if you are a parent and you're going to be coming to me for consultation on your situation, on the future situation, on document review or something, and you have involved mental health people, I'm a second opinion. I would like to know what the symptoms are. Okay, so you can ask your mental health person, anybody, individual therapist, ask them, individual therapist, to document this. If they haven't assessed for this, then that's an inadequate assessment. I'm going to suggest they may have misdiagnosed the pathology. And the danger with a shared persecutory delusion is if you misdiagnose a shared delusion, you become part of the shared delusion. You become part of the child abuse. And you become part of the spousal abuse of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon. That doesn't happen in any other pathology. If you misdiagnose ADHD, you don't become a participant in child abuse. If you misdiagnose autism, you don't become a participant in child abuse. If you misdiagnose a shared persecutory delusion, you're going to become a participant in the child psychological abuse and the spousal abuse of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon, because this is a narcissistic borderline dark parent who's manipulated you, okay, immensely manipulated, and you were seduced by the pathology into being a participant in it. The mental health person is a participant in the child abuse because they are practicing beyond the boundaries of her competence, not applying the established knowledge, violating ethical standards, and so failing in their duty to protect. Not only failing in their duty to protect, they are participating in the abuse. That's so bad, and it's going on currently in the family courts. Where are the licensing boards? Nowhere to be seen. Why is that? Where's the APA? Where are they've abandoned? The pathology isolates its victim from reporting and rescue. That's what the pathology does. That's a sex abuse pathogen that's moving through the generations here. It isolates its victim. So, any diagnosis, as we return to clinical psychology, any diagnosis that is returned into the legal system will be a disputed diagnosis. One party or the other is going to dispute it, especially when it's a child abuse diagnosis. The appellate system in healthcare for a disputed diagnosis is second opinion. This is from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in a paper entitled Improving Diagnosis in Healthcare. Clinicians may refer to or consult with other clinicians, formally or informally, to seek additional expertise about a patient's health problem. The consult may help to confirm or reject the working diagnosis, or may provide information on potential treatment options. Clinicians can also recommend that the patient seek a second opinion from another clinician to verify their impressions of an uncertain diagnosis, or if they believe this would be helpful to the patient. So, think about it. Medical health care. Doctors consult all the time. You go in and say, "Oh, this hurts." They say, "Let's get an orthopedic consult." All the time. We need to start consulting a lot more in the family courts around the clinical diagnosis of a shared delusional disorder, factitious disorder, attachment pathology, family systems pathology, to verify diagnoses and to support the diagnoses. When possible child abuse is a considered diagnosis, our return diagnosis has to be accurate 100% of the time, because misdiagnosing child abuse is too devastating to the child. And the way we can make sure it's 100% accurate is we get second opinions on these diagnoses, because it's way too important. And this is my recommendation for the solution for the family courts, is we have two litigants, each making an allegation of abuse towards the other. In one, the child's symptoms make the allegation of abusive range parenting, and oftentimes that's supported by verbal statements from the child or from the allied parent. The other side, the targeted parent, is saying it's a false, factitious attachment pathology being imposed on the child, and it's a shared persecutory delusion. It's not true, okay? And it's being created by the inducer, by the allied parent. So we have two allegations of abuse from each party. Judges do not diagnose pathology. We need to get that out to a proper clinical assessment, a diagnostic assessment to the appropriate differential diagnoses for each parent. Is the targeted parent abusing the child in some way? Let's assess for that. Is the allied parent psychologically abusing the child, creating a delusional disorder and factitious attachment for secondary gain? Let's assess for that, and let's get a second opinion to support those diagnoses. And so what I recommend is the court appoint a primary assessor, the primary person who's going to conduct the assessment in their office, and then that each litigant be allowed to appoint a second opinion consultant to participate through telehealth in that assessment. That ensures that the concerns of each of the litigant parents is properly represented in the clinical diagnostic assessment. I guarantee if you get a report coming back from 3 doctors into the court, the court's going to get excellent information on which to base its decisions. And so just get somebody to do the assessment, get to telehealth, and that should be routine in the family courts. We can do second opinion consultants using telehealth. Psychology, clinical psychology supervises all the time. We supervise our interns, we supervise our postdocs, we film ourselves, we show our training videos at training time. Second opinion is all the time. At my clinic where I was working, we had those one-way mirrors where we could have the therapy going on inside. We have the trainees and people. We do this all the time in healthcare. Let's do it in the family courts because it's so important to get an accurate diagnosis. We need to stop the fighting around these kids. So let's get the assessment and let each party appoint their second opinion consultant. Now, I prefer this diagram for the same thing because you can say I've rotated on its side. And so you have that first part, the court, you got the two litigants, they each get a second opinion, and that diagnostic assessment feeds back into the court. But the legal system lands on the wrong endpoint. They land on the custody decision. That's not the proper endpoint. We need to fix things. That's treatment. We need an effective treatment plan based on an accurate diagnosis. And so now, if you have these two approved consultants, one from each litigant parent, and they participated in the diagnostic assessment, then each of those consultants also becomes available as treatment progresses to the treatment provider as they're doing treatment, which will again improve the quality of services, improve the quality of the diagnosis, improve the quality of the treatment. There are only two causes of a failed treatment. Either one, the pathology is misdiagnosed and we're treating cancer with insulin, patients dying from the cancer, or two, the diagnosis is accurate, but the treatment for that diagnosis is being incompetently delivered. Because if the diagnosis is accurate and the treatment for the diagnosis is competently delivered, the problem will be resolved. So if you have a treatment failure, and I would put that about 3 to 6 months is when I'd start thinking we have a treatment failure if we're not making expected progress, then it's either misdiagnosis or incompetent treatment. I'm going to assume that it's competent treatment. It could be both, but I'm going to assume it's competent treatment. And so the first place we typically look is misdiagnosis. If there's no treatment progress, if if we misdiagnose the pathology, I can guarantee you, I work child abuse, that no treatment for child abuse, any other forms of child abuse, will be effective as long as I'm sending the child home to be abused. So if I've got sex abuse and I'm sending the child home to be sexually abused by the stepdad, my treatment for sex abuse is not going to be effective. Or if I'm sending the child home to be beaten with electrical cords by their mother, my treatment for physical abuse is not going to be effective. The treatment for child abuse is to protect the child, first thing. And that's typically the protective separation from the child. And that's important for the child's understanding as well in terms of the treatment of child abuse. And so we need to land on the proper endpoint, treatment, which requires an accurate diagnosis. Are we treating cancer or diabetes? That's going to be really critical. And so we need to get an accurate diagnosis. Let's get second opinions on that. That's the solution. Now, in addition, I would just say I've got the contingent visitation schedule that adjusts the visitation schedule up or down based on the child's symptoms. This is a treatment for factitious disorder imposed on another, factitious attachment. It is not the treatment for authentic child abuse by the targeted parent. If it's authentic child abuse by the targeted parent, do not do the contingent visitation schedule. If, however, it is a factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child, then the contingent visitation schedule is exactly the right thing to do. So diagnosis guides treatment. Is it a true attachment pathology or is it a false attachment pathology? That's what we need to know from the doctors so that we can do an effective treatment plan. So in 2024, last August, I presented at the APA National Convention on how to, for mental health people, for the psychologists, on how to organize and run a contingent visitation schedule. Then I came home and used exactly the same slides and presented exactly the same talk to my YouTube channel. So if you go to my YouTube channel, you will see my 2024 APA presentation using the same slides and everything from my office here, my online office, talking about how it works, how to structure it, and how to run a contingent visitation schedule. So I'm doing everything I can possibly do. Okay. I'm competent in attachment pathology. I have early childhood mental health. I'm competent in delusional thought disorders. I spent 12 years being trained in the diagnostic assessment at UCLA. I'm competent in factitious disorders. I'm trained out of children's hospitals, where factitious disorder shows up. I'm trained in family systems. I've been working family systems my entire life, and I've been in the family courts for the last 15 years. Okay, familiar with this pathology. I've noticed all the appropriate professional organizations. I'm going around for my second notice. And I have now provided notice to a set of prominent forensic psychologists related to my concerns. So I am now encountering both the disabled mental health system and the forensic psychologists in it. They're going to be responding, I would anticipate, at some point to the information that's being provided, and we'll see what their response is, and then we'll take it from there. But at this point, there are no competent mental health services in the family courts. Very soon, it appears there will be no mental health services, period, competent or incompetent in the family court, because it will simply be too dangerous. If you're not competent, then Dr. Childress is going to be a danger for you of doing a second opinion review of you. And they're not competent. So the forensic psychologists are going to flee. They're going to be told to leave eventually by the powers, because their forensic evaluations are dangerous and harmful to children and lack scientific value. So they're going to get rid of them. So now you have no forensic custody evaluators, and you have no clinical side people, and you got Dr. Childress walking around making sure that people are competent, and there's nobody competent. So going back for a second, it's called building capacity. Okay, that this is the way to build capacity, is you start pairing people and you start improving the quality. So let's say I'm appointed as a second opinion by one of the parents here. I'm now participating with two other doctors. And so now when we finish up, they now have the experience of working with Dr. Childress on this, and hopefully their level of competence is increased by that. That's why we do consultation in healthcare. We do it because it improves the quality of healthcare services. So we should be doing that a lot more to improve the quality of healthcare services. But the ignorant and competent psychologists don't want to do that, because then they'll need to leave if they need to be competent, or they need to acknowledge that they weren't competent before, which they don't want to do. And so there's a variety of conflict of interest issues. So with that, that wraps up my Sunday coffee talk on my encounter. My world is kind of interesting. A lot of changes taking place that kind of mimic and surround or mimic the changes in our cultural and societal surrounding events. So it's a lot of chaos going on right now, a lot of disorganization. The difference is, in the family courts, I have a path out of this, return to established healthcare. It's not something new. It's going back to established healthcare, diagnosis and treatment. Doctors stop being doctors. When doctors don't diagnose pathology, that means that judges have to. And judges aren't trained in that. So we got judges diagnosing pathology and doctors making custody decisions. That's a failed experiment. Doctors need to diagnose and treat pathology accurately, and judges can decide on custody just fine. So with that, I'm going to head out to my Sunday here. Good luck, everybody, and take care. Talk with you next week.